Yes.
Yep.
They have no survival instinct.
It's true.
They're in the last phase of their life and they act like they know it.
A great start to the video.
It's the
Yep.
dead ones litter the floor. Oh my god.
Yes. We're currently experiencing the Box Elder Bug apocalypse of 2024. Hope it ends before spring begins.
May they all die off.
Yes. All right, we're continuing through the Acts of the Apostles. We're halfway through the book of Acts. And we'll actually cover some of the epistles before we jump into church history, so we really need to add a section there. But last 2 weeks we've covered their witness and testimony in Jerusalem, and then moving in Judea into Samaria. Tonight we start their progress towards the ends of the earth. And tonight we also get to cover a few of the epistles, the early ones that Paul wrote. Galatians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
So if you wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians before he wrote like Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and then both of the Corinthians and Romans, why did they put it in that order?
Largest to smallest.
That makes so much more sense.
That actually does make so much more sense.
Yep. First, largest to smallest written to churches, and then largest to smallest written to people.
And I suppose they just kind of moved 1st and 2nd Peter and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John together, so that way it wasn't more.
Yep, those are the general ones. They're written by other authors. Those aren't letters from Paul to Peter and John. Those are letters by different authors.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought those were by Peter and by John.
Yes, they are by Peter and John.
Oh!
Hear what I said.
And James.
They aren't letters from Paul to Peter and John. They're letters actually written by Peter and John.
Oh, I thought.
Just like you thought. You didn't learn
Yeah.
anything new, didn't change any thoughts. Just didn't understand me the first time through. Ends of the Earth 1 is what we come into. Now you'll notice that the book of Acts has quite the transition in tone and scope. Acts 1 through 12 is really general, and it's jumping from Peter and John to Philip, and then over to Barnabas doing things, and then back to Peter. And once we hit Acts chapter 13, Paul is at the center of the story. And he showed up a few times earlier, because he was around earlier, but he definitely was not the center of the story through most of the first 12 chapters. So that changes here. And when we talk about Paul going to the ends of the earth, it is really just Paul. The other apostles that we know they were doing things, and they were definitely ministering and going here and there, but it's not actually recorded in the book of Acts. The book of Acts really only covers the apostolic ministry of Paul from this point forward. Which brings me to a passage out of Ephesians 4. Paul writes here, and this is at the very end of his, or towards the end of his ministry. It says, "And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, or pastors in other translations, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ." If you remember, we've introduced most of these different ministries. We've had the apostles around since Jesus appointed the 12, but others are added to their number as we go through the book of Acts. And we see Philip, who ministers in Samaria, and later he's known as an evangelist, but he doesn't come back onto the scene until Acts 21, I think. And we've seen a few prophets. Does anybody remember the prophet who prophesied about the famine? Agabus, yes. And now we have a new one getting entered in here. In Acts 13 at the very beginning, it says, "Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers. Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul."
They had the friend of Herod the Tetrarch.
Yes, and I think that would be Herod Agrippa, but I'm not sure which Herod. There are 17 Herods in the New Testament. And,
Are you serious?
yep, I'm dead serious. 17 different people from that family.
So is that
Is
like
Herod just
the,
like a
It's kind of like a family surname. And so you have Herod Agrippa, Herod the Great, Herod, the other dude, and
imagine
the other Herod.
Imagine
There are a few greats in the world.
Alexander the Great, Peter the Great.
Catherine the Great.
Yep. And then there's Charles the Magnificent.
Wait.
Yes.
So lifelong friend, is that like the other guy where it's like an administrative position or whatever, kind of like Hushai the Archite?
I don't know if that's an administrative designation or if he was just a informal friend. Anyway, Simeon, who is called Niger. Does anybody know what that Latin word means? Niger. I believe it's Latin. Hmm? You can think of the country, Niger, and then there's Nigeria. Any associations?
Africa.
Yeah, it's associated with Africa. Yep, this guy was probably from Africa. It actually means black. He was probably a Cushite or somebody of dark skin. Simeon, who was called Black. Lucius of Cyrene. I don't think it's on any of your maps, but Cyrene is a city in North Africa, present-day Libya. So you have another African, but this is North African. Of these 5 guys, we know that at least 2 were prophets and at least 2 were teachers, because it says there were prophets and teachers. And we don't know whether there were 3 prophets and 2 teachers or 2 prophets and 3 teachers, because it does not specify.
Do we know which any of them were?
Suspicions on my part are that Barnabas was a prophet because his nickname was Son of Encouragement, and one of the key roles of prophecy is to encourage. And Saul, later Paul, in one of his letters, refers to himself as a teacher and apostle, and so I park him in that role, especially from his writing. He comes across likely as a teacher. The other 3, we never see again, don't know anything else about them. But anyway, the turning point that happens here is in the next verse. It says, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. And then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. And what's the key word there?
After fasting,
That's 2 words. Key word.
praying.
Sent. Yes.
Oh.
Yes, and what other word is associated with sent?
Oh.
No, it's apostle.
Yes, an apostle is a sent one. So here we have Paul and Barnabas being sent off, and this is the beginning of their apostolic ministry, being sent.
I see.
So we have their first journey. It starts in 45 AD, according to James Ussher's chronology. You will find there are several different chronologies of the book of Acts that peg slight variations to the dates. We're going to follow James Ussher for consistency's sake. Most will be within a year or 2, and largely it hinges on what year they think Jesus was crucified in. So if they think a different year of Jesus' crucifixion, they'll end up with different years for the entire book of Acts. When they leave on this journey, they take John Mark along with them as a helper. And the first place they go to is Cyprus, and this was Barnabas's homeland. He was a Jewish Levite from Cyprus when he was found in Jerusalem earlier. He had likely been at Pentecost, actually, because he shows up in Jerusalem with Peter before the scattering of Stephen's stoning. So he's been a believer for 12 years now. While they're in Cyprus, they preach in synagogues from Salamis all the way out to Paphos. And if you've got your map of the first journey, you probably see that Salamis is on the east side of Cyprus, and Paphos is on the far side. So they worked that island from one side to the other. While they're in Paphos, they confront a sorcerer by the name of Elymas, and he gets struck with blindness. And the Roman proconsul sees this, and he believes, because there's nothing like a demonstration of the power of God in the real world, right before your very eyes, to get your attention. Now, this part of the trip is actually skimmed over just a little bit. But at that point, they take a ship to Perga, This is likely when Paul was shipwrecked, as he references in 2 Corinthians, and when he says he spent a day and a night on the water. We don't know that for sure. In the Acts account, it does not connect that. Paul did take other journeys, but when they got to Perga, John Mark leaves them and returns to Jerusalem. And this becomes a key point of division a little later in the book of Acts. Paul and Barnabas continue on. They take a road to Pisidian Antioch. And Pisidian Antioch is a church in the region, or is a city in the region of Galatia. When they get there, they preach in the synagogue, just like they had through Cyprus, and you'll see that this is part of the pattern that they have. Now, I don't think we've ever talked about where the synagogues ever originated. This is a Jewish thing that popped up during the Babylonian captivity about 600 years earlier, because they had to figure out, how are we Jewish if we don't have a temple? Babylonians destroyed the temple, they don't have a temple to go to, and everybody had to figure out what does being Jewish look like, and they created the synagogue in the Babylonian captivity. And even after they rebuilt the temple, they still maintained the synagogues because they were distributed widely. Any place that the 10 Jewish men were living, they could form a synagogue. And so a small group of Jews could form one, and they would meet on the Sabbath. And this ends up actually being kind of like the cradle of the church in the early days, because the church was largely made up with Jews, and Paul and Barnabas, on their trips, as you'll see, always start by going to the synagogue in any city. They did that in Cyprus, they continue doing that in Galatia. In Acts 13, in Pisidian Antioch, they actually record one of the sermons that was given in a synagogue. And Luke was not there to actually have heard it, but he probably heard a similar message many times while he was traveling with Paul. But this actually gives some of the passages in the Old Testament that they were referencing to testify and justify how Jesus was the Messiah, and the Messiah had to die and be raised again. And so we actually see that message that they're delivering to the dispersed Jews. After they give this message, a week goes by. Next Sabbath, the whole city of Pisidian Antioch, Jews and Greeks, gather to hear them. The Jews get really jealous because they've never had a crowd like that before. While it was just them around, why did Paul and Barnabas get a crowd? So they reject the message. Paul and Barnabas surprise them by pivoting towards the Gentiles. They had been bringing a message to the Jews, but they were going to Gentiles as well, because in Antioch, Gentiles were believing. So then many Gentiles believe, and a persecution arises, which becomes a recurring pattern. And so they flee Pisidian Antioch and go to the next Galatian city, which you can look at on your map. This is Iconium. They get to Iconium. They first go visit the synagogue. It says many people believe. Then some of the Jews who don't believe stir up the Gentiles against Paul and Barnabas, and they plot to stone them. So Paul and Barnabas flee Iconium quickly, and they go to Lystra, another city in Galatia. Lystra, they preach to a crowd, and this doesn't actually look like it's in the synagogue because they're out amongst all the townspeople. But there was a crippled person who was listening. He has faith to be healed. Paul commands him to stand up, and he stands up, and he's healed. And the crowd, in their native language that Paul and Barnabas can't understand, start declaring, "These two men are gods come to us in human form." And one of the priests of Zeus there declares that one of them is Hermes and the other one is Zeus. And then they start trying to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas figure out what's going on, and this is just absolutely horrifying to them. Kind of the opposite of the message that they're trying to preach. So Paul and Barnabas prevent them from offering the sacrifices. It was very challenging, apparently. So then Jews from Iconium and Antioch come over and stir up the whole crowd. And then the crowd stones Paul. They drag him outside the city and leave him for dead. It is thought that this may have been the time where Paul actually went to heaven and had a revelation that he spoke about in 2 Corinthians, that he knew a man who once was taken to the third heaven, but that was kind of an indirect way of saying I once was taken to the third heaven and had a revelation of things that I can't say and share with anybody.
What's the third heaven?
So, first heaven is like the sky and outer space above us, and it's in the natural world. Second heaven is oftentimes referred to as the supernatural realm that is in our midst, because we clearly have angels and demons that interact with the creation and the physical world, but we don't see them much, and so that's considered the second heaven. And then third heaven is like the throne room of God. So that's one model of first, second, and third heaven. Not explicitly laid out in scriptures, but it's implied when Paul says he was taken to the third heaven that there must be a first and a second.
So if he can't share it with anyone, why does he say it?
Yeah, so in the context of the letter he was writing, it makes a lot of sense, and he doesn't share anything that he heard in the revelation, he just shares that he had a revelation. But then this does point towards why he is able to write certain things to the Thessalonians. He seems to know things that other people didn't know. Let's see. Anyway, Paul's not actually dead. Or if he was dead, he gets raised back to life. But in any case, he's able to get up and he walks to Derbe with Barnabas, which is just down the road. And their time in Derbe is not actually described hardly at all in the book of Acts. And so perhaps it was a little more peaceful and Paul has spent the time recovering from his wounds and injuries. But many people become disciples in Derbe, and another church gets planted here. So then they begin their return trip to Antioch, and they start heading back the way they came. So they revisit Lystra, Iconium, and Pisidian Antioch. They end up in Perga again, and they appoint elders in the churches that they planted in these places. And it sounds like they visited the synagogue in Perga, so there may have been a church planted there as well. But the 4 Galatian churches are Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Pisidian Antioch. And then they don't sail from Perga, they go to the other port, Attalia, which is just to the west. Perga and Attalia are closer than their map actually implies. And they sail from there to Antioch. They report to the church what God did, and they actually stay in Antioch for a solid 5 years then. And that passage of time does not come across in the book of Acts particularly well. It just says a long time. What?
So it says a long time, and it's like, then they went on round 2.
Yeah, almost, not quite round 2. Something else happens first. Missed that slide. Alright. So then while they're in Antioch, a conflict arises around circumcision, because from Judea, a bunch of believers come down and they are preaching that believe in Jesus, that's good, but you still have to follow all the customs of Moses and be circumcised in order to receive salvation. And this is like the hot controversial topic in the church of their day, which you'll see Paul is revisiting time and time and time again. So this dispute arises with Paul and Barnabas. They take on these guys quite aggressively. There isn't any resolution in Antioch, and so they all decide to travel down to Jerusalem to present this to the apostles and the elders for a decision, because everybody wants to be on the same page. So this happens in 52 AD. It is known as the Council of Jerusalem, and it's the only church council that's recorded in the book of Acts, but later, when there are other controversial decisions that need to be sorted out, the church follows this model and they gather all the church leaders together. So you'll have the Council of Nicaea, the Council of this place and that place, and all kinds of church councils are recorded in church history. The Council of Jerusalem happens here. So the issue that they're considering is, do the Gentiles have to follow the customs of Moses, including circumcision, in order to receive salvation? And the Pharisaical Jews make their case. Paul and Barnabas make their case, talk about all the things that happened amongst the Galatians, how they believed they weren't following the customs of Moses. Peter then stands up, and you remember he was the one who first brought the gospel to a Gentile. and he has a vision where God says, don't declare unclean what I have declared clean. And so he makes the case that way back when I went to Cornelius's house, God made no distinction between Jew and Gentile, and he recounts that the Holy Spirit was given to them, showing that God accepted them. And they received the Holy Spirit without any profession of faith. They had just believed in their hearts, and they had not been water baptized even. And this was a very serious sign in Peter's mind. James confirms Peter's opinion and issues a judgment that no one conflicts with, and this is James, the brother of Jesus, not the James who's dead, nor the little James, the other James. And he says we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles to believe. And they make the case that we haven't been able to follow the law of Moses for 2,000 years. Why should we ask them to follow it? So then they send a letter up to Antioch, and it's got 4 stipulations. Abstain from food sacrificed to idols, abstain from blood, abstain from meat of strangled animals, and avoid sexual immorality. And some of these remain controversial throughout the rest of the New Testament period because Paul actually makes a very good case about how food sacrificed to idols is no different than food found in the regular marketplace. But at this point in time, this is where the church lands. Part of it is just that if the Gentiles are eating food sacrificed to idols, it's going to be very difficult for the Jewish believers in the same towns to really accept them, because it's going to be doing something very detestable to the Jewish believers right in front of them. The abstaining from blood, drinking blood was kind of associated with pagan worship rituals, and so that one is kind of associated with you've got to worship only one God.
Right.
And the meat of strangled animals, I have never figured out what he's referring to there, honestly. Avoiding sexual immorality is pointing towards there are some moral stipulations in the law of Moses that carry through. It's not like we're throwing off everything. They're just dispensing with the ceremonial laws and not all of the moral laws, which then of course introduces conflict unending. Are tattoos a ceremonial law, or are tattoos a moral law? Controversial in some circles. Anyway. At this time, they send Silas and Judas up to Antioch with the letter, and they are confirming the letter with their verbal account. And they are known as prophets and leaders amongst the disciples in Jerusalem. And there's an interesting episode that is recorded in Galatians that would imply that around this time Peter actually comes up and visits Antioch, but he is persuaded by some of the Jews not to associate with the Gentiles, even though he was the first Jewish believer to associate with Gentiles. And even Barnabas, who was a disciple of Peter's, is swayed and withdraws from associating with the Gentiles until Paul comes and rebukes Peter publicly. And that is in Acts, or in Galatians chapter 2. So that's an episode that doesn't happen in the book of Acts. And this brings us actually to the book of Galatians. So this is Paul's first letter to the churches. It's written just after the Council of Jerusalem, but it's before Paul's second journey when he goes and visits the Galatian churches. And the Galatian churches would be Pisidian, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Be really good trivia there. Which church is not a Galatian church?
Gosh, no.
Find some small town mentioned here and there.
You would say Perga or something.
Right, exactly. Perga, Attalia, Tarsus. Make something
Tarsus
up.
is easy, because Tarsus is Paul's hometown.
Okay, so we won't have that as an option
I
then.
should not have said that.
Where is Tarsus?
Tarsus is in Cilicia.
Oh, got it.
Yep. So not too far from Antioch, actually, which is why Barnabas was able to go find Paul. That is Paul's hometown.
Well, that's why I had to find, because it wasn't like close. He had to actually like
Yep,
Travel.
actually had to get around over there.
Do you reckon he took ship or do you reckon he went the roundabout land?
I have no idea how Barnabas traveled. Now, the book of Galatians, Paul is specifically countering the message of the circumcision camp, because they are preaching that you have to be saved by faith and following the law of Moses, and Paul's contention is we are not justified by works of the law, but through our faith in Jesus. And that comes across in Galatians 2:16. And so he uses this entire letter to address this fallacy because it was getting widely preached in the churches because people were leaving Jerusalem and going out and visiting churches wherever they found them and adding to the message of the gospel. And part of it was the Jews were just so associated with following God as being a cultural Jew. And so you do this and this and this and this, and this is what it means to follow God. And Paul was really the first one of them to recognize we can jettison all of the cultural stuff of being a Jew, and Greeks can actually believe and be saved as well. And they can be Greek Christians, not just Jewish Christians, or become Jews. That's important for us as Americans to remember. When we go to other countries, we're not trying to Americanize them. We're trying to bring the gospel to them. In Kisii land, Kenya, we would always talk about so this is what our church does in America, but what does this look like to the Kisii people of Kenya? You do music differently. Don't try to do American songs because they sound terrible in Kenya. But Kenyan songs sound amazing. We can't do them in America because we're lousy American musicians. We can't do Kenyan Kisii land songs. They have amazing musicians, and they had some bad musicians too, but the amazing ones were a lot of fun to listen to. Anyhow, so that is the summary of the book of Galatians. I think it was part of the reading. That is Paul's first epistle that he writes. And we're shifting into the second missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas end up splitting up over John Mark, because Barnabas wants to take him. I have this feeling in the back of my head that John Mark might have been a relative of Barnabas, but I can't remember for sure. But in any case, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark, and Paul did not want to take him because Mark had deserted them on their first journey. And they could not come to an agreement, so they end up deciding to go their different ways. So Barnabas and Mark go to Cyprus, which is where they had gone on their first journey. And Paul takes Silas and visits Galatia, which was the second half of their first journey. Lots of people try to figure out who was right and who was wrong, and my own opinion on the matter is that God was trying to take one apostolic group and split it into two, because then they can minister in two places at the same time, instead of only one place at a time. Follows the principle of multiplication. So, Paul and Silas is who we end up following then. Now they go overland, not by ship, through Syria and Cilicia, visiting some of the churches there. It's possible they went through Tarsus. I don't remember exactly where the road goes through. Then they visit Derbe and they visit Lystra, two of the Galatian churches. While they're in Lystra, they pick up Timothy as a helper. And ironically, Paul has just written a letter to the churches of Galatia saying, you don't believe in circumcision, you don't need to be circumcised. They get Timothy and he circumcises him, which seems like it would be really counterproductive. But it seemed to be a pragmatic motion of just trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. Because one of the things you'll notice is that everywhere Paul goes, he faces hardship and persecution and conflict. Taking a Greek along, or a half Greek, half Jew, along with him would be challenging and just introduce unnecessary conflict if he doesn't take care of that on the front end. But at the same time, they're delivering the decision of the Council of Jerusalem through the course of this trip to the churches in Galatia. Presumably they stop in Iconium and Pisidia and Antioch as well. Eventually, they make their way over to Troas. And this is not an easy journey. They try to go to Asia, can't go to Asia. Try to go to Mysia, can't go to Mysia. Can't go to Bithynia. And it seems to be attributed to the Lord preventing them from getting to any of these possible places. They land in Troas. Paul has a vision of a Macedonian man calling him, and so then they leave by ship for Macedonia. And it's in Troas that Luke joins them. It's a real subtle thing in the book of Acts. You can tell when Luke is with Paul because he uses the pronouns we and us. And if he's not with Paul, then he talks about they and them.
I did notice the shift in pronouns on Welsh.
Yes. The shift in pronouns implies that Luke joins them in Troas and then stays in Philippi in the next chapter. And in Philippi, they don't go to a synagogue, which would imply that there are very, very few Jews in this city. It's actually a Roman colony. It is not a Greek or Macedonian city as much. This is going to be heavily settled by Romans, but there were a handful of Jews. This is where the having to have 10 Jewish men to form a synagogue is necessary, which implies how small the Jewish population is. When they didn't have 10, there was a traditional place of prayer that was usually close to the water source of the village or the city. And so they went to where they thought this place of prayer would be on the Sabbath to see what Jews will actually come and show up. And Lydia shows up there, and they preach to her, and she believes. They stay in Philippi with her for a while. Eventually they run across this fortune-telling girl who drives them bonkers, and so Paul drives a demon out of her, and then she can't tell fortunes anymore, so the owners are very, very distressed and get them thrown into prison. And this is when there's an earthquake. They get let out of prison, the jailer gets saved, and his whole household gets baptized. So remember, if you ever end up in a tough circumstance, it might just simply be God putting you in position to intercept somebody who needs to hear the gospel that you would never otherwise run across, or who they otherwise would not actually be receptive. The best way to run across a jailer is to be in jail with the jailer. And having an earthquake where the whole prison opens up and nobody actually leaving is a good way to get a jailer to have a come to Jesus meeting, which he does. Anyway, the next day they discover that they've imprisoned Roman citizens without
That was hilarious.
Yes, without giving them a trial, and this was very embarrassing, and they just wanted to get rid of these guys, so they send them off, and Luke apparently stays in Philippi because we don't see the we and us pronouns going on anymore. He rejoins Paul later, though. So from Philippi, he goes to another Macedonian city, Thessalonica, and he goes to the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths. A whole lot of people believe. Once again, the Jews who don't believe stir up a crowd. They get a mob, start a riot. They can't find Paul and Silas, and so they grab Jason, who is a believer, haul him in front of the city officials. The city officials are horrified at all the accusations because they're accusing them of stirring up a sedition against the Roman Empire itself. And so they have Jason post bond, they release him, and then the believers get Paul and Silas out of Thessalonica very quickly. So they're in Thessalonica for like roughly a month, maybe even if only 2 or 3 weeks of a month.
That's why there's 2 books to Thessalonica.
Yes, they were not able to finish preaching and teaching in Thessalonica, which is why in short order we have 2 letters written to the Thessalonians. So they go to Berea. Every now and again you'll come across a church that's called Berean Baptist or something like this. The Bereans have a reputation amongst evangelicals because they eagerly listen to it and they search the scriptures to verify the word that Paul and Silas were preaching. So if you see a church that's called Berea or Berean, it usually means that they put a high value on the scriptures. Or at least when they named the church they did, if they don't any longer. But in Berea, many Jews and Greeks end up leaving. Then the Thessalonican Jews come over to Berea, stir up the city, and they get Paul sent off to Athens really quickly. And Timothy and Silas end up staying in Berea, but Paul requests that they end up getting sent down to join him as soon as they can. And this brings us to Athens. And the year shifts here. We're into 54 AD now. So Paul's down in Athens by himself, and this rarely ever happens. He's almost never ministering by himself. He's almost always got people with him, which is probably why he requested that Silas and Timothy come down and join him in short order. But while he's in Athens, he makes use of the time, and he talks to the Jews in the synagogue, and he talks to anybody who will listen to him in the marketplace. This gets him an invitation to the Areopagus, and he gives a really interesting, unique message to the Athenians who will listen. If you read that sermon, it is different than any of the other sermons in the book of Acts. And it is tailored to his audience, and a few people believe. Now, some people like to point at only a few people believing it was a lousy sermon, never do anything like that ever, and such. But I think only a few people believed because the Greeks in Athens were not looking for a Messiah. They were a very challenging cultural group to try and connect with. The Jews in the synagogues were looking for a Messiah, waiting for a Messiah, somebody coming with a message, the Messiah came, would have their attention, and more of them would readily believe. It is not like that with the Jews today, but in Paul's day, that was the easy, low-hanging fruit of preaching the gospel. After Athens, Paul goes down to Corinth, and this is down in Achaia as well, not too far from Athens. It's on an isthmus there, and so Corinth is actually a really important seaport. There was the long route around the Peloponnesian Peninsula, but a lot of ships would come into Corinth, and there was a port on both sides of this isthmus, and sometimes they would just simply pull the ships right across the top of the isthmus and down the other side, as they had slave labor back in the day, so you could just drag ships across land, and it was only 3 miles. So nowadays there's actually a really cool canal that they carved through there. It is crazy narrow, and but it's wide enough for cruise ships to go through, and so it makes for really interesting photographs.
Yeah,
Yes.
I can imagine.
Maybe we'll dig one of those up later. Let's see. While he's in Corinth, he meets Priscilla and Aquila. And these were Jews that had been exiled from Rome while Claudius was the emperor, because he had exiled all the Jews from Rome. I don't remember what provocation there was, but this is historically attested to, a known historical event that is corroborated in the account in Acts. They happened to be of the same profession as Paul. They were tent makers, and so they start making tents together and go into business until Silas and Timothy rejoin Paul. So they preach in the synagogue. The Jews oppose him, and so then Paul devotes himself to the Gentiles. He has a dream. God says he's opened a door there, and he stays in Corinth ministering for 18 months, which is longer than he spends in any place ever. So he spends a lot of time in Corinth. While he's there, there's no shortage of opposition, of course. The Jews end up taking Paul to court, while Gallio is the proconsul of Achaia. Gallio hears the charges, and he's like, if you had a reasonable charge to make against Paul, some serious crime, then this would be appropriate, but you're talking about laws and names of your own religion. I refuse to settle this dispute. So then the Jews go out and they take Sosthenes, who was a believer, and he actually gets mentioned in the book of 1 Corinthians, and they beat him up in front of the court, but Gallio doesn't pay any attention to that. Paul survives, though, and doesn't get beat up. Sometime after that, not immediately, but sometime after, he ends up going back towards Antioch. But while he's in Corinth, he writes the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He had been in Thessalonica such a ridiculously short time, he sends them first letter because when Timothy and Silas rejoin him, they bring questions that the Thessalonians had about the second coming of Christ. And so 1 Thessalonians addresses a lot of these types of questions. And there are things that Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians where you're like, this seems to be a unique revelation that Paul has had because it's not found in the Gospels from Jesus, and the book of Revelation hasn't happened yet, and so Paul has some knowledge that has come across in the church at some point in time, is not drawn out of the Old Testament either. So then he sends this letter up to the Thessalonians. They read it. It probably gets distributed around to the other Macedonian churches, but we don't know for sure. It was addressed just to the Thessalonians. Word comes back to Paul, and so he writes a second letter to them because they had follow-up questions. And so 2 Thessalonians also deals with themes of the end, and then Paul also warns them against idleness at the end of that letter. Essentially, the end should be soon, but don't just be an idle person waiting for it. There's work to be done. And what do you know? Almost 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting for the end. So, anyway, so these are his second and third epistles. And they start taking a little bit more of his traditional form. Galatians is a little more unique. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians have a lot more standard Paul structure to them. The greeting and the farewell at the end. Let's see. So then, after that, he leaves Corinth. He sails across the Aegean Sea to Ephesus with Priscilla and Aquila. He does not do anything in Ephesus, but Priscilla and Aquila stay there. That is the second or third largest city in the Roman Empire at that time, and so it was a very significant hub. That would be the equivalent of Los Angeles or Chicago in the United States. Very serious city. And Priscilla and Aquila, we run into them again in Ephesus later. Paul, though, continues on to Antioch. He goes there via Caesarea, which is down by Jerusalem. He says he went up to the church, and so it is possible that Paul went and visited the church in Jerusalem before going on to Antioch. And that concludes his second journey once he gets back to Antioch, but not Pisidian Antioch. So we just covered Paul's first journey with Barnabas, his trip down to Jerusalem for the council there, and his second journey with Silas. Maps have lots of good information. I was pleased with how well developed they are, and they've got notes of the big events that happened at various different places. And the regions are reasonable facsimiles of where Galatia and Cappadocia and Asia are. So that helps bring a little life to the word, understanding the geography.
So the 7 churches from Revelation, that's all John? So John formed all those, or?
Nope, we'll run into them. Ephesus is planted by Priscilla and Aquila, actually,
Oh, yeah.
and Paul ministers there some later, but that was most likely started by Priscilla and Aquila, and I don't know. Paul ministers there for like 2 years, I think, and it says everybody who lived in Asia heard the gospel, and so that would seem to imply that he was going around to other cities as well, or sending people out to other cities. Colossae, I think, is one of them. Where is that?
Colossae in Asia.
It's in Asia. It's next to Laodicea. It's not one of the 7 churches, I suppose. Yeah. That's a place that we don't think Paul actually visited. He wrote a epistle there later, we'll find, though. That's jumping forward. Any other questions? All right. Well, next week we'll conclude the book of Acts, but it does not conclude the New Testament. Nor does it conclude Paul. Go ahead.